They say it's just hair, but that night, when I woke and touched my head, feeling the uneven snips and ragged edges, I realized it was never about the hair. It was about control, about taking something that belonged to me and turning it into a joke without asking, without a single word of permission. My granddaughter, the one I once cradled in my arms, the one whose tiny fingers wrapped around mine like a promise, had cut my hair while I slept. She said it made me look younger, that it was a fun makeover, something to brighten up my days, but she never stopped to ask if I wanted it. I only found out when I reached up that morning and my fingers brushed against those jagged patches, and I felt something inside me crack. Not the strands falling away, but the invisible thread that held us together. I'm 81 years old now, and I live in the small converted garage behind my daughter's house, a place with a bed that creaks when I shift, and a kettle that whistles too loudly for such a quiet space. It's humble, but it's mine in a way that feels different from the rooms upstairs filled with laughter and social media. I've learned not to complain. I've learned that sometimes the quietest voices are the hardest to hear. But the thing about hair is that it is more than just hair. It's memory and identity. It's the silver river that tells stories of survival, of decades woven with love and loss. And now it's been trimmed without warning, without respect. It was that moment, the sharp tug of betrayal that woke me fully, when I realized I was no longer the grandmother I had been for so long. I'm not the quiet old lady who sips tea and knits by the window, a backdrop to youthful energy and modern chaos. I am now a woman whose body has been claimed and reshaped by someone else's idea of what I should be, and it left me feeling invisible and loud all at once. The house around me hums with life I am no longer part of. Upstairs, my daughter laughs with her friends, her phone buzzing with notifications, while I sit alone in the dim light of my small room, the uneven strands falling like tiny betrayals into my lap. It's a strange kind of loneliness, to be surrounded by family and yet feel like an outsider in your own story. The silence that followed the haircut was not peaceful. It was heavy, filled with a tension I couldn't name at first. I went through the motions. I boiled water for tea but poured it down the drain. I touched my face in the mirror, but saw a stranger looking back. The neighbors stopped dropping by like they used to, the casual visits replaced by polite nods through closed curtains. It was as if the haircut was a signal, a starting line for a new chapter I hadn't asked for, and yet no one seemed to notice the shift. My granddaughter smiled, oblivious to the damage she had done, proud of her makeover, and my daughter told me it was good content for social media, a phrase that felt both foreign and cruel, as if my pain was entertainment for strangers who would never know me. I remember the first Sunday after the haircut, the first Sunday I missed church in 32 years. I stayed home, avoiding the mirror and the church pews where people once greeted me as Mrs. Thompson with warmth that now felt like a distant echo. Instead, I sat by the window in the fading light, my fingers tracing the gaps in my hair, wondering how something so small could unravel so much. I thought about the years I spent building this family, the meals I cooked, the stories I told, the quiet sacrifices I made so my children and grandchildren could grow with more ease than I ever had. And yet here I was, treated like a project, an experiment, a doll whose strings could be cut for a laugh. The house smells different now. It smells like cheap shampoo and adolescent bravado, a scent I can't wash away. My presence feels like an afterthought, a minor inconvenience to be managed and then shared online for laughs. I am not angry, not in the way people expect. My anger is quieter, deeper, a sorrow that settles in my bones and refuses to be dismissed. It's the sorrow of watching the people you love shape your identity without asking, rewriting your story in ways that leave you lost. And so, here I am, in this small space behind the house, wrapped in an old cardigan that smells faintly of lavender and mothballs, staring out at the backyard where my granddaughter plays, unaware of the chasm that has grown between us. I am not the woman I was yesterday. The hair is gone, yes, but what's left is a decision forming quietly inside me. A decision to reclaim the story, to speak the words that have stayed locked inside for too long. To find a voice not just for me, but for every woman who has been silenced in the name of fun, or care, or love. They say hair grows back. But what grows back after trust is broken? What grows after the promise of respect is cut away like so many strands in the night? I don't know yet. But I do know this. I will not be a silent witness to my own erasure. Not anymore. And if this story finds you, if you have ever been made small, made quiet, made a joke, know that your voice matters. That your body, your choices, your life are yours and yours alone. And sometimes, the first step to healing is simply saying, no more. It wasn't until that evening, when the house had quieted down and the soft glow of the kitchen light spilled over the linoleum floor, that the true weight of what had happened settled around me like a thick fog I couldn't shake. My granddaughter had gone to bed hours before, probably dreaming of the next trend she wanted to try out on me, and my daughter was busy scrolling through her phone, eyes flickering with indifferent amusement as she watched the video clips their friends had sent about the grandma makeover. I was left sitting at the small kitchen table, the uneven ends of my hair catching the dim light like shards of something broken. The scissors had been left on the counter, careless and sharp, like the memory of a moment I wished I could erase. I picked them up, weighing their cold metal in my hand, trying to understand how something so simple, so trivial to her, had cut through me so deeply. I thought about all the years I had spent knitting warmth into scarves, brushing my hair carefully each night, and the pride I felt in the slow silver that marked the passage of decades, and how, in one night, it was reduced to a jagged reminder of my own invisibility. That was the catalyst, the first undeniable act of disregard that made clear to me that I was no longer seen as a person to be respected or consulted, but rather as a fixture to be altered and shared, a story for amusement rather than connection. The next morning, as the sun filtered weakly through the thin curtains, I dressed in silence, pulling on the sweater I had worn the day before, the one that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachet tucked in its pocket. I avoided the mirror, but I knew the changes would be there, reflected back in the eyes of others. At breakfast, the family gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the overhead light and the cold detachment of social media notifications. My granddaughter sat across from me, her eyes bright with excitement, oblivious to the way I flinched each time she glanced my way, as if waiting for praise or a reaction that I no longer felt able to give. My daughter, always the mediator between their worlds, laughed as she showed me the comments on her phone. Grandma's new look is everything. Who knew she had it in her? Ultimate glow-up. I didn't say a word. I could feel the silence stretching between us, thick and suffocating, like the air before a storm. That was when I realized that this was no longer just about hair. It was about a shift in how I was perceived. No longer the matriarch, the keeper of stories and traditions, but a prop in their digital playground, a character in a script written without my voice. The house itself seemed to echo this change. The familiar creaks and groans that once felt like a home now sounded like warnings, reminders of the distance growing in the spaces between us. Over the next few days, I watched as the makeover continued in small, relentless ways. New clothes chosen without my input, makeup tutorials attempted while I napped, videos posted with captions that reduced me to a punchline. The girl was proud, her laughter ringing through the house like bells. But beneath it all, I felt a quiet rage simmering just beneath my skin. My daughter dismissed my discomfort, calling it harmless fun and a way to keep us connected. But I knew better. I was being erased, piece by piece, and no one seemed to notice or care. At church that Sunday, I sat in the back pew, the uneven strands of my hair tucked beneath a scarf I had borrowed from a neighbor. The familiar hymns washed over me, but my heart was elsewhere, heavy with the weight of loss I couldn't quite name. The other women whispered kindly when they saw me, but their eyes lingered briefly, as if unsure what to make of the woman who looked so familiar, yet somehow changed. I thought about all the Sundays I had stood beside my husband, singing loud and clear, teaching our children the words to the old songs, and how now I felt like a ghost watching from the sidelines. The catalyst was not just the haircut, but the way it marked the beginning of a new reality, one where I was no longer the center of my family's universe, but an afterthought, a curiosity, a source of entertainment. At night I lay awake in the cold garage, the uneven edges of my hair prickling my neck, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of laughter and footsteps I was no longer part of. The betrayal was not loud, it was quiet, creeping in slowly, disguised as love and care, but beneath it, a deliberate erasure that no apology could undo. I realized then that I needed to find a way to reclaim myself before I disappeared completely. The scissors on the counter were a symbol, a call to action, a reminder that the thread connecting me to the family was frayed, and if I didn't act, it would snap entirely. The catalyst had done its work. It had shattered the illusion of togetherness and forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding for too long, that I was no longer seen, that my voice no longer mattered. And with that realization came a strange kind of clarity, a painful but necessary awakening that the life I had known was changing, and I would have to change with it, or be lost to the quiet darkness of invisibility. After that first cruel haircut, life did not settle back into the old rhythms. Instead, it began a slow, quiet unraveling that crept into every corner of my days and nights, filling the spaces between family laughter with a silence so heavy it felt almost physical. At first, it was the small things that shifted. The way my granddaughter no longer waited for my permission, but acted as if I were a doll to be dressed, styled, and displayed on her terms. She began treating me like a project, her artistic experiments expanding from haircuts to clothes, accessories, and even makeup. I remember the first time she brought over a box filled with clothes she had picked out for me. Bright youthful colors and strange fabrics that rubbed against my skin like a reminder that I no longer belonged in my own wardrobe. She called it updating my look, and when I hesitated, she smiled with the certainty of someone who had never learned to hear the word no. "Trust me, Grandma," she said, "this will make you look fresh and modern." But the truth was, I looked like a stranger in those clothes, as if the person who wore them had been erased, replaced by a costume designed to please others. My daughter did not stop her. Instead, she seemed to find amusement in the whole thing, often calling me good content and encouraging the girl to keep experimenting. It felt as though my discomfort was a joke, a performance for their entertainment rather than an invitation to genuine connection. I stopped complaining, though it hurt more than I let on. The house, once filled with warmth and familiar smells, grew colder, more impersonal. My knitting chair, once a sanctuary where I would lose myself in soft yarn and quiet thoughts, was now pushed aside, occupied by boxes and props for their photo shoots and videos. The neighbors who used to stop by with fresh-baked bread or just to chat over the fence stopped coming altogether, their friendly visits replaced by curt nods through closed curtains and hurried glances. The slow erosion of my presence felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind, not by strangers, but by my own family. I found myself retreating, shrinking into the small space of the converted garage, where the thin walls offered little protection from the noise of their digital world. The laughter that once filled the rooms upstairs became a distant echo, a reminder of how far I had been pushed to the margins. My granddaughter's TikTok videos featuring me as a before in a series of comedic transformations accumulated likes and comments from strangers who saw only the surface. The gray hair chopped off, the confused expressions, the forced smiles, but never the woman behind the screen, the woman whose story had been rewritten without her consent. I felt myself becoming a caricature, a vessel for their amusement rather than a person with feelings and history. My daughter once said to me, almost in passing, "She's better quiet, honestly. She gets so dramatic." Those words sank deep, cutting through the last of my defenses. To be called dramatic when all I wanted was to be seen, to be respected, was a cruel twist. I found myself speaking less and less, afraid that any protest would be dismissed or laughed at. The conversations around me became a blur of words I didn't belong to. Slang, inside jokes, plans for outings that didn't include me. Even the small courtesies I once took for granted, a cup of tea offered, a hand held, a smile that reached the eyes, became rare and fleeting. I remember one afternoon in particular, the day the granddaughter brought over a bag of makeup and sat beside me on the worn sofa, chatting excitedly about how just a little touch-up would bring out my eyes and soften the wrinkles. I let her apply foundation and lipstick while I sat still, feeling like a museum exhibit more than a grandmother. The lipstick was too bright, the foundation too thick, and the whole process left me feeling invisible beneath layers of someone else's idea of beauty. When I looked in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because of the makeup, but because of the way I had surrendered a small piece of myself without realizing it. It was not just the physical changes, but the emotional erasure that followed, the steady shrinking of my space in the family and in the world. I found myself questioning everything, my worth, my place, even my memories. Had I been too quiet too long? Had I allowed myself to be pushed aside with too much grace? The house, which once felt like a home, now felt like a stage set where I played a role I never auditioned for. The quiet escalations became harder to ignore. My favorite books, missing from the shelves, replaced by magazines about youth culture. My phone screen filled with notifications I didn't understand or want. Family dinners where my opinions were brushed aside as old-fashioned. Each day, the invisible line that marked my belongings seemed to shift further away. I started to avoid eye contact, to retreat into myself, to let the silence grow louder than the words I wished I could say. I tried to hold on to the memories of better days, the smell of Sunday roast cooking, the sound of my husband's laugh, the warmth of a child's hand in mine. But even those began to feel distant, like echoes from another life. One night, as I sat alone in the dim light of my small room, I realized how much I had changed. Not physically, but inside. The quiet acceptance, the way I had stopped fighting, the way I had allowed myself to be minimized. It was a slow, creeping suffocation, a suffocating grief for the loss of who I once was and who I was allowed to be. Yet amid this growing isolation, something else began to stir, a faint but persistent spark of resistance. I caught myself lingering longer in front of the mirror, tracing my own reflection with renewed curiosity, trying to remember the woman beneath the layers of imposed identity. I started taking small walks beyond the backyard, past the familiar streets where neighbors smiled politely but distantly, past the places I used to frequent with my family before I became invisible. These walks were quiet acts of defiance, a way to remind myself that I still belonged to the world, even if my family seemed to forget. Slowly, the first embers of agency began to glow inside me. I realized that this was no longer a matter of enduring, but of reclaiming. The haircuts, the makeup, the videos were just symptoms of a larger truth, that I had been silenced for too long. The quiet escalation was a call to awaken, a summons to stand, not just in the shadows of others, but in the full light of my own existence. This realization did not come with fanfare or sudden clarity, but with a slow, steady build, like the turning of a tide. I began to imagine a life where I was not a prop or a punchline, but a woman with a voice and a choice. And with that imagining came the courage to plan the first steps away from the quiet erasure I had suffered. It was not an easy path, the emotional cost was high, the loneliness deeper than I could have anticipated. But in that quiet unfolding, I found the strength to say, without words, that I was still here, still standing, still worthy of being seen. The first escalation was more than a series of small cruelties. It was the beginning of a journey back to myself, one jagged strand at a time. One evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm of distant laughter and the hum of electronics, I found myself alone in my small room, with nothing but the fading light from the window and a photograph I had discovered tucked away in an old box. It was a picture of me from many decades ago, taken in Havana in 1959. A younger woman with bright eyes, wearing a red silk blouse that caught the sun, and cat-eye eyeliner that made her look fierce and alive. Holding that photograph in my hands, I felt a sudden surge of something I hadn't realized I'd been missing, a spark of recognition, not just of who I was then, but of who I could still be. That moment was a turning point, a quiet but profound shift in my soul. For years I had allowed myself to be defined by others, shaped into a version of myself that fit their narratives, their expectations, their amusement. But in that photograph, I saw a woman who had her own stories, her own dreams, and a strength that had been overshadowed by decades of silence and compromise. That night, I placed a small hand mirror under my pillow, as if hiding a secret treasure, a reminder that I was reclaiming a piece of myself even if the world around me did not yet see it. The following days brought subtle changes. I began to care for what remained of my hair with renewed tenderness, brushing it gently and savoring the sensation of the strands against my fingertips. I took longer walks than before, venturing beyond the familiar boundaries of the backyard and neighborhood. Those walks were a kind of meditation, a way to breathe in life outside the walls that had begun to feel like a cage. I stopped to watch the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, to listen to the distant barking of a dog, to feel the rough texture of tree bark beneath my hands. These small moments grounded me, reminding me that the world was vast and full of possibilities beyond the narrow confines of the house and the social media stories that reduced me to a caricature. I did not speak more. My voice was still fragile, still cautious. But I listened differently. I listened to the rhythm of my own heartbeat, to the quiet resilience stirring inside me. I found myself humming old songs I hadn't sung in years, songs my mother used to sing, songs that held memories of strength and survival. I began to keep a small journal, writing not for anyone else but for myself, capturing fragments of thoughts, dreams, and reflections that had been buried beneath layers of hurt and neglect. Each word was a small act of rebellion, a stitch in the fabric of a new identity I was beginning to weave. The house around me continued its usual chaos, but I no longer felt swallowed by it. I found corners of peace amid the noise, a chair by the window where the late afternoon sun cast golden patterns on the floor, a cup of tea made just right, the soft purring of a neighbor's cat that had taken to visiting the garage. These moments became my sanctuary, small islands of calm in a turbulent sea. There was no sudden epiphany, no dramatic confrontation, just a slow, steady gathering of strength and clarity. I began to see the acts of disregard not as the end but as the beginning of a new chapter. The uneven haircut was not just an injury, but a challenge, a provocation that forced me to look inward and find a way to respond not with anger or despair, but with quiet determination. The hand mirror under my pillow was more than a symbol. It was a tool for transformation, a daily reminder that I was still here, still whole, still deserving of respect and love. I started to imagine a future where I was not the punchline of a social media joke, not the silent figure in the background, but a woman with agency and dignity. I thought about the stories I wanted to tell, the life I wanted to live, the boundaries I needed to set. This shift was not without pain. The memories of betrayal and invisibility lingered like shadows. And there were days when the loneliness pressed so hard, it felt like the walls were closing in. But even on those days, I held on to the image of that young woman in Havana, fierce and alive, and the promise that somewhere beneath the layers of hurt, she was still inside me, waiting to be heard. This was the midpoint, the moment when I began to act, even if only in small ways, to reclaim my voice and my story. It was the turning point where resignation began to give way to resistance, where silence started to break, and though the path ahead was uncertain, I felt a quiet hope kindling inside me, a hope that would grow stronger with each step I took toward reclaiming my life. The fragile sense of calm I had begun to build was soon tested by a wave of events that threatened to pull me back into the shadows I had struggled so long to escape. It started subtly, as most escalations do, with whispered conversations and sidelong glances, but quickly gained momentum until it became impossible to ignore. One morning, I overheard my granddaughter talking to her friends on the phone, her voice light and careless as she joked about the next experiment they planned for me, saying, "Tonight, we try makeup while she sleeps. It'll be hilarious." The words struck me with a chill that went far beyond the surface humor. They revealed a disregard so deep it was almost cruel, a boundary so thoroughly crossed it left me feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. That night, while the house fell into silence and the hum of distant television filled the rooms, I lay awake, my mind racing with a mixture of fear, anger, and resolve. The thought that I might be further reduced to a spectacle, that my dignity might be stripped away without my consent once more, was unbearable. But with that unbearable weight came a clarity. If I did not act, if I allowed this to continue, I would cease to exist in my own right. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I waited until the house was asleep, the soft breathing of my daughter and granddaughter echoing through the thin walls, and I stepped quietly into the main house. The darkness was thick, and the familiar sounds of night settled around me like a shroud, but I felt a strange kind of strength coursing through my veins. I moved slowly to the drawer where the kitchen scissors had been left after the first haircut, the cold metal gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I held them tightly for a moment, feeling the weight of years and memories in my hands, and then I reached for a disposable razor, the one my granddaughter used to shave her legs. It was a tool of transformation, of control, of identity, and I was about to use it to reclaim my own. Quietly, with care and precision, I began to remove her eyebrows while she slept, each careful stroke a statement, a boundary drawn in the silence. It was not an act of vengeance, but of assertion, a way to say, "This far, no further." When morning came and the house erupted in chaos, I sat calmly at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the storm unfold. My daughter's voice was sharp, a mixture of shock and anger as she confronted me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell, Mom?" she demanded, her words slicing through the tense air. My granddaughter was sobbing softly in the corner, her fingers brushing at the sparse patches where her eyebrows had been, but I did not flinch. I met their eyes steadily and said simply, "I thought we were doing makeovers." The words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of all that had been unspoken and ignored. It was a moment of reckoning, a fracture in the carefully constructed narrative that had reduced me to a joke and a project. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not as a prop, not as a caricature, but as a woman who would no longer be silenced or controlled. The house felt different after that day, the air thick with unspoken tension and shifting power. My daughter tried to frame my actions as irrational, even dangerous, calling it violence and crazy, but beneath the words, I sensed a reluctant acknowledgement of boundaries crossed and dignity reclaimed. The lines had been drawn, and there was no going back to the way things were. In the days that followed, the atmosphere was heavy, But I found a strange peace in the clarity that confrontation had brought. The invisible walls that had confined me began to crumble, replaced by a cautious respect I had not expected. I was no longer just the grandmother who could be dressed up and edited for amusement. I was a person with agency, with limits that demanded recognition. This second escalation was not just a confrontation with my family, but with the part of myself that had been willing to endure too much silence and invisibility. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable truths about love, respect, and the cost of silence. The act of removing her eyebrows was symbolic, a way to reclaim control over my own body and story. But it also marked a turning point where I realized I would have to fight not only for myself, but for the respect that every woman deserves. There was a new tension in the house, an unspoken understanding that the old dynamics had shifted. My granddaughter, though hurt, began to see me in a new light, not just as a source of amusement, but as a force to be reckoned with. My daughter, while still protective of her children, began to tread more carefully, her tone softer, her demands fewer. I was no longer invisible, and that changed everything. This escalation tested my resolve and deepened my understanding of what it meant to stand firm in the face of disregard. It taught me that reclaiming one's dignity is not always loud or dramatic, but can be a quiet, steady assertion of self in the everyday moments. It showed me that sometimes the most powerful actions are those that say, "I am here, and I will not be diminished." As I navigated the days and weeks that followed, I felt a growing sense of clarity and purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, and the wounds, both seen and unseen, would take time to heal. But the act of standing up, of drawing that line in the sand, was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where I could rebuild my life on my own terms, where respect was not something I begged for, but something I demanded and embodied. This second escalation was painful and difficult, but it was also necessary, a crucible that forged a stronger, clearer sense of self. And as I look back now, I see it as the moment when the silence broke, when the quiet storm inside me became a force that could no longer be ignored. It was the moment I truly began to reclaim my life, my voice, and my dignity. The moment I decided to face them was not marked by fury or dramatic confrontation, but by a quiet, unshakable resolve that had been building deep inside me for weeks, born from the accumulation of every cut, every whispered joke, every act of disregard that had chipped away at my dignity. I knew that the life I had once lived, one defined by silent sacrifice and patient endurance, had ended the day my granddaughter took scissors to my hair while I slept. Since then, the house had been a battleground of subtle cruelties and small humiliations, and though I had found strength in silence and solitude, the time had come to reclaim my story in a way they could not ignore. When my daughter stormed into my small room that morning, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief, I was ready. She held the envelope in her hand, the one with the letter I had written, short and cold, laying bare everything I felt but had never said aloud. "You can't just do this, Mom," she said, her voice sharp and trembling. "You're tearing the family apart." I looked at her steadily, seeing the strain behind her anger, the fear disguised as control. "I am not tearing anything apart," I replied quietly, folding my hands in my lap. "I am putting myself back together." She scoffed, disbelief etched in every line of her face. But I knew this was the moment she had been afraid of. The moment when I stopped being the quiet grandmother, the one who smiled politely and nodded and became a woman who demanded to be heard. The house felt heavy with tension as she read the words I had penned with steady hands, words that refused to soften or explain. They were not accusations or pleas, but statements of fact, declarations of boundaries long ignored. "I am no longer your project," I said, "no longer your source of content or amusement. I am a person, deserving of respect." The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock, measuring time in moments that felt both endless and decisive. Later that day, the confrontation spilled over into the kitchen where my granddaughter sat, still raw from the night I had shaved her eyebrows while she slept. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. "Why did you do it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I met her gaze with calmness I had not known I possessed. "Because you showed me what it felt like to be controlled without consent," I said. "Because dolls don't stay quiet forever." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and though she was hurt, I saw in her eyes the first flicker of understanding, not of approval, but of recognition. My daughter accused me of cruelty, of madness, of jeopardizing the family's peace. But I understood then that peace built on silence and erasure was no peace at all. It was a fragile facade that masked deep wounds and resentments. That evening, I sat in my small room, a cup of tea warming my hands, thinking about all that had led to this moment. The scissors, the razor, the uneven hair, the missing eyebrows, they were symbols of a larger truth, a reckoning with a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and made small. I thought about the countless women whose stories were never told, whose voices were silenced by those closest to them, and I felt a fierce determination to be different, to be heard, to be whole. I began to write again, this time letters not filled with anger but with clarity and grace. Letters to myself, to my granddaughter, to the daughter who had struggled to balance love and control. Letters that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The climax of my journey was not a loud declaration or a public spectacle, but a quiet, powerful reclaiming of my dignity and my voice. It was the moment I stepped out of the shadows of others' expectations and into the light of my own truth. I realized that I could no longer be complicit in my own erasure, and that standing firm in my boundaries was the most profound act of love, for myself and for those around me. That night, as I looked in the mirror, the uneven strands of hair no longer felt like wounds but like scars, reminders of battles fought and won. The absence of eyebrows was not a mark of shame, but a symbol of courage, a statement that I would no longer be invisible. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, that healing would take time, and relationships might never be the same. But I was no longer afraid. I had taken back my power, and in doing so, I had rewritten the story of my life. The house was quiet now. The tension softened but still present. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, feeling a peace that came not from reconciliation or forgiveness, but from the simple truth of standing tall. I had finally found my voice, and I would never let it be silenced again. After everything that had unfolded, the silent betrayals, the whispered jokes, the sharp edges of rejection and reclamation, I found myself standing at a crossroads that I had not anticipated. The house that once felt like a home was no longer my refuge, but a place where memories and pain mingled too closely, and I knew it was time to step away, not just physically, but emotionally. Moving out was not an act of defeat, but one of profound self-preservation. I found a small, modest apartment just a few blocks away, a space with no curtains and no carefully curated social media moments. But it was mine. Here, in this quiet refuge, I began to rebuild a life that was no longer shaped by the expectations or whims of others, but by the rhythms of my own heart. The first days were both strange and healing. I filled the silence with small rituals, brewing tea just the way I liked it, listening to the rain tapping softly on the window, and letting the warm light of the sun spill across my hands as I turned the pages of a book I had read countless times, but never truly understood until now. It was in these quiet moments that I began to find peace, not in grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but in the simple act of being present with myself. I received a weekly visitor, an old friend who brought flowers and stories, who never asked too many questions or demanded explanations. Her presence was a balm, a reminder that connection did not always require performance or sacrifice. Slowly, I started to weave myself back into the fabric of the world. I walked the streets with my head held a little higher, feeling the cool breeze on my face and the rough texture of worn sidewalks beneath my feet. I found a small community center where women my age gathered to share stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. I began to bake again. First simple recipes that reminded me of childhood, and then more complex ones that challenged me to create and nurture. Each cake, each loaf of bread, was an act of reclaiming my identity beyond the roles imposed on me. I realized that to heal was not to forget or forgive blindly, but to choose myself every day, to honor the woman I had always been beneath the layers of imposed silence. There were no grand apologies or dramatic reunions, just the quiet understanding that some relationships change or end, and that's okay. I carried with me the lessons of my journey, the courage to say no, the strength to set boundaries, and the wisdom to recognize when it's time to walk away. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the late sun cast golden hues over the city, I wrote a letter, not to my family, but to myself. I told her she had waited too long for someone else to save her, that she had always held the key to her own freedom, and that letting go was not losing but gaining. I taped that letter inside my dresser drawer, a secret promise for the days when doubt crept in. The last line I wrote was simple but true. Well done. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear the soft rustle of leaves and feel the weight of peace settling over me like a gentle blanket. I think of the women who might be listening to this story, those who feel unseen, unheard, and unloved in their own homes. To them, I say this: you do not have to wait for permission to reclaim your life. You do not have to accept the roles others write for you. You are not too old, too broken, or too quiet to begin again. Your story is yours to tell, and your voice is worth hearing. If my journey has taught me anything, it is that the truest freedom comes not from the approval of others, but from the courage to stand alone, to speak your truth, and to walk your own path. And when you do, you may find, as I did, that the world shifts quietly beneath your feet, opening doors you thought were forever closed. So take that step. Be your own sign, your own noise in the silence. And when you find your way back to the light, come tell me. I'll be here, waiting to listen. I did not expect the aftershock to arrive in such ordinary packaging. A knock at the side door while the kettle was just beginning to breathe, and the neighbor's cat was pawing at the torn screen like a tiny inspector. But there it was, a polite rap. And then another. And when I opened the door, a woman stood there with a clipboard hugged to her chest and a smile that tried to be gentle and official at the same time. She introduced herself by first name only and said she was from Adult Protective Services, which landed in the air between us like a teacup set down a little too hard, not enough to break, just enough to make a sound you remember, and I stepped back. To let her in because I was not afraid of sunlight or paperwork or the weight of my own account. She took the only chair and I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded so she could see them, a habit from other ages when women learned to make their quiet visible. She spoke softly and explained there had been a complaint about a family conflict, an allegation of mutual harm. Not to frighten me, she said, simply to understand if I felt safe, if there were resources I needed, if this garage with its crooked curtain and faithful kettle was a place I chose, or a place I had been placed. Her words were careful in the way people are when they have learned that language can bruise. I listened and nodded and told the story in the order a stranger might understand, not from the beginning of my life, but from the night of the scissors, the morning of the mirror, the sound of laughter that didn't match the shape of my face, and then the sleep, and then my hand in the dark, moving with a steadiness that surprised me, not to injure, but to answer, a measured reply to an ongoing theft. She wrote without interrupting, then looked at me the way nurses do when they are checking a pulse you cannot fake, and asked if I wanted to file anything formal, if I wished to relocate, if there was a friend to call, if I knew my rights. I said I did not wish to be moved like furniture, and that the worst harm in this house had been the kind that leaves no bruise, and that yes, I knew my rights, though it had taken me 81 years to name them out loud. She asked to see the space where I slept, and I gestured to the bed with its clean quilt, and the small trunk at the foot where I kept my photograph from Havana and my journal, and the comb that had belonged to my mother, and she smiled in a way that said she had seen worse and better, and that this, at least, was mine. And then she told me she would close the case if I consented, though she would leave a number on a card in case the ground shifted again beneath my feet. When she left, I stood for a long moment with the door open and let the air move through, and for the first time since the shaving, the house did not feel like a sealed jar. The day felt porous, and I could breathe in the world beyond our tent's orbit. News travels along the thin wires of a family faster than truth, and by evening my daughter had gathered herself into a knot of indignation and came down the steps with that tight smile she saves for company and emergencies, asking in a voice so careful it might cut whether I had called the state on them, whether I had told lies to strangers, whether I understood the damage I had done. I told her I had opened a door and answered questions, which is not the same as calling a storm, and she stood there counting her arguments like spoons in a drawer, then set them down, one by one, until only her tiredness remained. For a moment I saw the girl she had been, the one who braided her own hair too tight and got headaches, but wouldn't undo it because she liked the neatness of control, and I felt the ache of a history I could no longer carry for her. She said the word boundaries, as if it were a foreign island we were both trying to reach in a leaky boat, and I said it back, not as a threat, but as a shoreline, and then she retreated because retreat is sometimes the bravest thing a person can do, when their story has been challenged and they do not yet have a better one. The next morning I put on the sweater with the mended elbow and walked to the bus stop 2 streets over, away from the usual route to church or the grocery, and rode 3 stops to a little salon that smelled of eucalyptus and old gossip. I chose it because it was not the kind of place my granddaughter would photograph. No neon letters, no ring light, just a woman with steady hands and a calendar crowded with first names and handwritten hearts. I told her I wanted the past evened out, not erased, and she nodded like she had heard that before in other words, and she washed what remained of my hair with a patience that felt almost ceremonial, and when she cut it, she did not try to make me a younger or new. She tried to make me honest, which is a rare skill with a pair of shears. In the mirror I met a woman who could walk into any room and not apologize for the shape of her life, and I paid in cash and tipped more than I could afford because gratitude needs room. And on the way out I saw a rack of scarves and chose one the color of pomegranate skin, deep and hard to name, and tied it loosely so the edges of the cut could breathe. On the bus home, I sat beside a boy with paint on his knuckles and a sketchbook on his knees. He glanced at me, and then at the scarf, and said his grandmother wore that color when she argued with his grandfather and always won, and I laughed and told him color is a flag we plant when words won't listen, and he nodded like he might remember that for later. The days that followed slipped into a new rhythm that had the shape of me in it. I began to wake earlier, not from dread but from curiosity, and I walked a little farther each morning, past the bakery where the owner counted the till with the door propped open and the warm smell of yeast escaping like a rumor, past the park where the dog walkers collected in clumps and traded weather like stock tips, and onto the community center where a notice board hung heavy with the weight of small hopes, a chair yoga class, a call for volunteers to read to children on Wednesdays, a Bavieros flyer for a grief group, whose edges had curled from too many fingertips. I took 2 flyers and a breath, and left my name at the desk for the reading hour without explaining why it mattered. The woman at the desk stamped a form as if she were ordaining me into something old and necessary, and I walked home feeling taller than my bones could account for. That afternoon, my granddaughter eased herself into the garage like a cat, aware of the breakable things, her brows already penciled back into existence but thinner, tentative, her face unreadable in the way of teenagers who are still learning how to hold guilt and pride in the same expression. She did not apologize, and I did not demand it. Instead, she asked me if I remembered when she was 8, and I let her paint my nails with glitter that took a week to remove. And I said I did, and she said she had never forgotten that I showed my hands to the cashier on purpose so the world would see the sparkles and know she had created something. And I told her there is a difference between being invited to witness and deciding to display. She picked up my comb and set it down twice, then looked at the pomegranate scarf and asked where I got it, and I told her, and she said it looked like something a woman would wear if she planned to change her life. And I said sometimes the life changes you and the scarf keeps up, which made her smile in spite of herself. She left with nothing settled and everything shifted, and I sat on the bed for a long time afterward and tried not to write a script for what would happen next, because that is a kind of control too. The reading hour was not grand, which is why it worked. The room was small and the children were smaller, and there were crayons ground into the carpet like fossils of color. And when I read the first story, my voice wobbled the way a bridge does when the river is high, and then it steadied, because stories are old technology and I am fluent in what survives. The children leaned closer in the way they do when a sentence is about to turn, and I let it turn slowly so we could all feel it. And afterward, a little boy with a missing tooth asked if I lived at the library because I sounded like a person who keeps keys. And I told him I used to keep keys in other houses, and now I keep them in books, and he shrugged like that made perfect sense. On the way out, a woman in a yellow cardigan stopped me to say she had seen my granddaughter's videos and was sorry, not in the pitying way, but in the way of someone who has survived a public shrinking. And she said if I ever wanted to talk, she ran the grief group on Thursdays, and they had room for grief that wasn't about death, and I said I would think about it and then did not have to, because the room inside me had already said yes. The group was a circle of chairs and a box of tissues and the luxury of time. We spoke in the tense that hurt the least, some of us in past, some in present, and a few of us brave enough to risk the future, and no one corrected us. I spoke of erasure as if it were weather and of consent as if it were a door some people do not see, and an ex-nurse with hands like anchors nodded and said, boundaries are not walls, but moats. Water that makes everyone think before they cross. And I wrote that down later in my journal and underlined it twice. After the meeting, the woman in yellow told me that sometimes APS visits help, and sometimes they bruise, and that the best armor is documentation and the second best is a choir of witnesses. And I realized I had begun to gather both without meaning. 2. The salon receipt, the bus tickets, the volunteer schedule, the names of people who had looked at me and not through me. When you start changing, the house notices. The kitchen felt different, not because anyone moved the chairs, but because I began to sit in one without apologizing for the way it scraped the floor. My daughter experimented with new tones, some softer and some sharp like old knives, and we circled each other with the wary respect of people who know the map has been redrawn. She suggested a family meeting, and I said I would attend if we used a timer and did not interrupt, and she laughed and said I was turning into a podcast, and I told her boundaries are not entertainment, they are infrastructure, and she put a hand over her eyes and said she was trying, and I believed her because trying looks messy. At the meeting, my granddaughter brought a notepad and wrote words like consent and image and trust at the top of the page. And when I spoke, she looked at me the way a student looks at a blackboard that has just given up a difficult proof. And my daughter kept touching her phone like a talisman, but did not pick it up. And when the timer rang, we stopped. Not because everything was fixed, but because we agreed to live inside the limits we had set, which was new. There was one more aftershock, the kind that arrives in envelopes. A letter addressed to me from a brand of shampoo thanked me for my participation in a campaign, and included a gift card that would not buy bread, but could cover hairspray for a year, and I knew at once that my image had wandered into a marketplace, without me, and I sat down and let the old tremor pass, And then I stood up and wrote 3 letters. One to the company demanding removal and an accounting. One to my granddaughter asking her to untangle what she had posted and what had been taken. And one to myself reminding me that a person can be turned into a product only if she consents or gives up, and that I intend to do neither. The company wrote back in a week with language that had been washed too many times, and my granddaughter came down the stairs with eyes wide as if she had finally seen the machine behind the curtain, and she said she had never imagined a joke could become a commodity. And I told her the world is full of merchants who will sell your reflection back to you at a price. And she said she would take down what she could, and write letters too. And for the first time I believed she had learned something. I had not had to carve into her. In the evenings, I practiced saying my own name out loud, first and last, not because I had forgotten it, but because names gather dust when no one speaks them with care. I wrote a list of the things I had authority over, and was surprised by how long it was. My hair, my sleep, my image, my stories, my time, my door, my tea, my yes, my no. I taped the list inside the cupboard where the mugs are, and when my granddaughter reached past it for the chipped blue one she likes, her hand brushed the paper and she read it and did not laugh, and later she brought me a small bottle of pomegranate nail polish and said it matched the scarf, and asked if I wanted to paint our nails and go to the library together on Wednesday, not to film, just to be. And I said yes, and did not narrate it for anyone but myself. I know this is not the end because endings are tidy and lives are not. But this was the part of the story where my voice stopped sounding like a visitor and started sounding like a resident, where the garage felt less like a compromise and more like a studio where a woman arranges the tools of her days and chooses what to make. The kettle still whistles too loudly, and the curtain still hangs crooked, and the cat still tests the screen. But I have learned to love the small interruptions that prove the world is still knocking. When I lie down at night, I slip the hand mirror back under the pillow, not as a guard but as a ritual, a way of promising myself that whatever the morning brings, I will meet it as the keeper of my own keys.